The youth of today has been widely outclassed. They do not consider themselves to be too young to be pampered, and they are not supposed to be old enough to take responsibility on their own shoulders. The main problem is the communication gap between them and their elders, the former believing themselves to be old enough for taking their own decisions for matters personal or social, while the latter just refuse to hand over this responsibility to them. This leads to temperaments rising high more often. The most common problem a person faces at this phase of life is peer pressure. They are pressures by either dares or threats into doing what one would rather avoid. 6 out of every 10 such people are usually short-tempered and rude in their response. Many hesitate in taking their parents' advice in different matters, particularly in issues which according to them are very modest, and thus they end up in taking up the wrong decision. There are many young people who cannot even afford to go to school. They remain illiterate. A number of them face problems, and some even lost their life or limb, doing jobs which are meant for older people. Sometimes, racism and/or discrimination against people of opposite gender, caste, creed or religion makes them a victim of emotional disorder. They have low self-esteem and can easily be overridden by views of other people. 21% of high school seniors say they get high, and 41% of the same group report drinking alcohol. Our kids are literally moving around in an intoxicated daze. Immature behavior is then amplified due to being under the influence. Drunk driving, poor grades and attendance, antisocial and violent behavior, and the list goes on. Schools play a major role in this endeavor, and therefore it is reasonable to expect that these places of learning would be safe havens for the children while they are preparing for adulthood. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. In many instances, especially in low-income, urban settings, schools can be a war zone. We are not talking about minor bullying, but rather serious violence. Our kids are fat and getting fatter. Recent numbers show that 20% of American children are obese. This can result in such issues as low self-esteem, depression, etc. Then there are the health concerns. High blood pressure, diabetes and other maladies that is associated with obesity. Psychologically and physically, obesity is an issue that can be resolved with a simple increase in activity and awareness. The youth cannot graduate or even drop out of school without going through the pains of a low-income job. The jobs offered with no experience pay very little, with very little room for pay increases. In fact, the competition to get a promotion can be fierce. In the past, your high school senior could graduate and go work at the local factory for the rest of his or her life and make a good living. They would not necessarily need to have a college education to survive. In fact, youth today will graduate from college with multiple degrees and still cannot find work that pays enough to sustain a decent lifestyle. Last but not the least, are the so-called love issues, which have dramatically been on rise since the past few years, but in mostly in the destruction of lives either by suicide or by eternal misery, which renders them mentally unfit. The depression overpowers them, and very few are able to cope up with it as another aspect of the ups and downs of life. Solutions to youth's problems. We should remember that the more we remain down to earth and enjoy life as it is meant to be, the better we stay for the rest of our lives. One should always remain aware of where his actions can lead him to in future. Though it is believed that everything is predestined in our lives, we still are responsible for our deeds, since God has provided us a brain to think before doing anything. Man is said to be learning throughout his life. It is not that one cannot recover later in life, but by then it may be too late, as time can prove to be the worst opponent in any fight. Therefore, we should take note of our slip-ups when there is time left, and even if failure approaches us, overcome it with complete domination. As John Keats once said, "Don't be discouraged by a failure. It can be a positive experience." Failure is, in a sense, the highway to success, inasmuch as every discovery of what is false leads us to seek earnestly after what is true, and every fresh experience points at some form of error which we shall afterwards carefully avoid. We all have a role to play in combating domestic violence and sexual assaults, in creating an environment for our youth that will see less offending and minimize the chances of youth getting involved in serious relationships at a young age.